National sovereignty is an obligation as well as an entitlement. A government that will not perform the role of a government forfeits the rights of a government. Good evening and welcome. This is Face the Nation. Our topic of discussion today is, does sovereignty matter? Geopolitics and citizens. Joining us this evening on the show are Javed Yusuf, attorney at law, Dr. Pavitra Jayawardena from the University of Colombo, Kusum Bujatilaka, foreign policy analyst, Udit Devapriya, chief international relations analyst from Factum, as well as Dr. Harinder Vidanage from the Kotalawala Defense University. Joining me as far as the questions and answers sessions is concerned is Niresh Thambi, consultant director at Newsfirst. You too can join in as far as the conversation is concerned. The number to send your WhatsApp messages to is 076 656 5353. The number once again, 076 656 5353. So let's get the ball rolling today with Javed Yusuf, attorney at law. What are your thoughts on our topic tonight?
Well, I mean, it goes without saying that this is very current and very appropriate for Sri Lanka at this point of time, because arising from the economic disaster that we faced in the recent past, it has impacted on sovereignty, and we have got caught in the whirlpool of geopolitics as a result. When any country, for that matter, becomes weak economically, obviously its political strength also weakens. And we have seen, as in the last few years, we have been reduced to almost begging from country to country. Now, when it comes to sovereignty, there are two aspects of sovereignty. There is national sovereignty. There is also sovereignty of the people. The very essence of democracy is that the people are sovereign, and everything that the constitution, as very much as in Sri Lanka, is intended to reflect and take the citizenry forward. So that's the sovereignty vis-a-vis the people. But when you look at national sovereignty and geopolitics, international relations, I think it is useful to remember a few things about what international foreign policy of any government or any country requires. One is, of course, you have the profile of the country internationally. We can deal with that in detail. Then is also the country. There is a saying, I think it's well known, that foreign policy is really an extension of domestic policy, and we have seen that very much in Sri Lanka, how it impacts. And of course, thirdly, the other role that a country or a government in its foreign policy implementation has to do is to look after the interests of its citizens, both locally and abroad. So all these are caught up in this geopolitical tangle that we have got into, mainly as a result of the disastrous economic performance of recent times.
Javed, you said that the citizens' rights should be at the center stage when it comes to sovereignty. But we see most of the countries right now are interfering in affairs in Sri Lanka. We see this happening quite well in the recent past. Why is that?
Well, the reason is, as I mentioned at the start, we are now economically very weak as a country, the economy. So as a result, we need to stretch our hands and make interactions with other countries in order to get a better deal to build ourselves economically.
Why I'm posing this question to you is, Javed, now, a visit by a political party in India those days was not deemed as news. Well, look at what's happening right now. The visit that was undertaken by the NPP to India recently has taken center stage. It's on the headlines everywhere. Why is that?
Well, I think, to me, the reading of that is that India has recognized that the JVP or the NPP is a serious contender for victory at the next election. Whether that popularity that is seen around will translate into votes is another matter. But the fact that India has recognized that, and India is very conscious of what is happening in Sri Lanka for obvious reasons, so that is a kind of a recognition.
We saw this happening in 2015, prior to the 2015 Yahapalne government coming into play. I still recollect a few months after Mahinda Rajapaksa addressing his men and women in his electorate said that the RAW had predicted that Maithripala Sirisena is going to emerge victorious. So there seems to be a very close comparison when it comes to neighboring countries, and Sri Lanka being sandwiched in the midst of all this.
Well, I don't know about RAW predicting victory in 2015. The countries which are interested in Sri Lanka, we have their ways of getting information. Sometimes the information is valid, not so valid, so on. But they have come to a conclusion that JVP is a potential winner. Not that they think that they are definitely going to win. But I think the reason that they got this exaggerated publicity, in my view, is I think a lot of media sections as well as opponents of the JVP have been somewhat hard on them, unfairly hard. Because if you look at every political party in the country, they have a bad record at some point or the other. So the mere fact that the JVP was recognized by India, I think may have upset various people, and they started harking back to the 88.
I'd love to talk about this subject, but today the topic is not this. So henceforth, we'll leave it at that as far as that is concerned. But I want to move towards Dr. Pavitra Javardhana from the University of Colombo. So, Dr. Pavitra, give us some context. Javid spoke about national sovereignty and the people's sovereignty. What does it really mean for the people of Sri Lanka?
Yeah, I was quite interested in the topic that you have picked up for today, why our sovereignty matters, geopolitics and citizen, because, you know, citizen, although when you look at the modern nation state, the state representatives are legitimized through their citizens, voters, and that's how a democratic structure would work. But when you really look at the discourses on geopolitics, which is still very security driven and state driven, we hardly talk about citizens. You know, we seem to be taking it for granted that, you know, geopolitical decisions, geostrategic decisions, security decisions, in terms of, you know, our relations with the foreign counterparts are being decided by rational actors who are in the, you know, the top tier for citizens, without really giving it a serious attention whether that's true. So in the geopolitics field, there is this emerging subfield called critical geopolitics, so feminist geopolitics, which actually talks about the bottom, which means these ordinary citizens, you know, how important it is to take the citizens' interest into account when a state makes geopolitical decisions. So in that sense, for me, I mean, I would think of sovereignty in very simple terms as the ability of a state to have the self-determination, you know, to make independent choices. So, so the state there, I would think both, I mean, it's people, and state actors are citizens' representatives. So for me, it's basically, you know, as we spoke earlier, citizens are in the center, but on the other hand, they are taken for granted too. So I mean, in the initial round, I would really like to highlight the fact that when we talk about sovereignty, historically we have looked at it from a security point of view, and that security is mainly, you know, military. When you look at the history, it's about invasions, it's about, you know, foreign occupations, all that. But we are living in a world where, you know, security is more complicated than, you know, military security. You know, you have economic aspects in it. You have technological aspect. We are living in a digitalized world. So are we really independent in terms of, you know, digital occupations that in our everyday lives, our choices are being affected. We might only see visibly it's if one country would invade us, that is what is visible. But there's also an invisible forces, a range of forces that affect our sovereignty, and is something worth to think about.
Right. Pavitra, you spoke about making independent choices and how important it is to make independent choices when we speak about sovereignty. But as a nation, as a country, does Sri Lanka have the privilege of making those independent choices when it comes to mainly economic matters?
Economic matters. I think no country has that independence in that sense. But see, for me, the essence of the human nature is independence. How are we free to pursue our liberty, freedom, and all that? And we all know that there are limitations. And even asking a philosophical question like, is there something called independence, or isn't it that everything is constructed? Even the choices that we might think that they are very personal and that's my personal choice, probably they might have been constructed by various other social, political, religious, historical forces. So I think when we say shouldn't take the literal meaning of independence, in that sense no one is independent, but it is how much we are conscious about.
Because if you look at matters, let's take a look at history, because I remember sovereignty used to be a buzzword in 2006 to 2009, the pre-era as far as the war was concerned in the country. We were talking about how sovereign we should be, that no state has to interfere in Sri Lanka's affairs, we have to be able to take our own decisions. But let's take globally. Let's take the Gaza conflict that took place a few months ago. Let's talk about the Syrian conflict. Let's talk about the conflict in Libya. Then 2001, the invasion of Afghanistan, then Iraq, Osama bin Laden being killed in Pakistan by US forces, entering a sovereign state. So all these matters have to be spoken about. So how important is sovereignty for Sri Lanka at this very moment of time? Because we see a lot of countries trying to interfere into our affairs.
I think we are living in a globalized world, and no one is in that sense independent if we make that barrier between domestic and foreign. Politically, clearly we have borders. Sri Lanka has its borders, but think of our economic market. Do we have clear-cut borders? We have very much transnational relations. In that sense, Shamir, we can even ask a question like how independent America is economically. I mean, America is dependent on Chinese economy as well. So that's the superpower, has a lot of military capability and all that, but economically they're trying to balance. So it's undoubtful that every country should have the sovereign ability, but I think the discussion is very much still centered on the
so
military
in a globalized
elements.
world, you are trying to say the word sovereignty should be thrown out of the window.
No, I'm not saying it has to be thrown out of the window, but it has to be reinterpreted.
Okay.
Why? Because probably earlier it would have been, all political, economic, social aspects were intertwined. So politics took precedence, and if you have political relationships, economic relationships come secondary, whereas now it's not like that. So I think sovereignty has to be reinterpreted in a practical terms.
Right. Thank you very much, Dr. Pavitra Javadar from the University of Colombo. I now move my attention towards Kusum Bujatilaka, foreign policy analyst. Kusum, very quickly before we move on to our topic tonight, I want to ask a question on what Javid spoke about.
Okay.
Potential winner in the next election would be the JVP. That is what India is thinking. Do you want to comment on that, or you want?
No, I'm happy to comment on that,
Yeah.
Shamir. Thanks for having me once again on Face the Nation. I think if you look at history, even the recent history, the last 20 years, let's say in this 21st century, if there's ever been economic collapse, economic strife, what generally happens, and even throughout, beyond the 21st century, in the political sphere in any country with a collapse, the electorate tends to move to the left. Generally speaking, it's a party with some sort of left formation, and generally on the spectrum, the furthest left formation gets the most votes post an economic collapse. There have been instances, Hungary, Italy with Meloni, Hungary with Orban, where it's gone to the right. But generally speaking, you see a leftward trend. Now, in Sri Lanka, the most leftward mainstream party is the JVP NPP, right? So I would suggest that if there was ever a moment in Sri Lanka's political history where a Marxist-Leninist party such as the JVP has the opportunity to win a majority, this should be it. I'm saying this is their best opportunity. If they don't do it this time, there won't be a set of circumstances that are this conducive to a potential win for the JVP NPP, given the economic.
So you're saying JVP and the NPP could be a potential winner at the next presidential election?
I'm saying all the evidence that we have right now suggests that they're a very strong player in the upcoming election, and I think rightfully so. I think.
Then what happens to the other political parties around them?
I think the polling suggests that the SJB's support has been around about the same amount it was, which wasn't enough to win a majority. Let's keep in mind. We've seen the UNP oscillate in the very early stages of the Vikram Singh Rajapaksa government. It kind of went up a little bit and then it's come down when the IMF tranche gets a little late. Then when the funds come in, his approval goes up again. So I think we're still a little further away from judging by the polls.
So getting back into the topic and trying to draw a parallel to what I asked you before, Sri Lanka being sandwiched in this geopolitical trauma, I would say. We are right now sandwiched in between China, we have India, we have the West, we have some other states who are very much interested in Sri Lanka's political affairs because of economic reasons. How do you view the visit made by NPP to India and India's high-level profile meetings that took place in that state when it came to the political party in question? Because in 88, 89, the JP was against the Indian policies, and that is why the insurrection took place in 88 and 89. But now they seem to have completely changed.
I don't agree that they've completely changed. In fact, if you notice, there was no conversation about the 13th Amendment when Jai Shankar, the Foreign Secretary or the Foreign Minister of India, met with AKD. There was no conversation about that. I don't think post
we don't know. We don't know.
We don't know. But they certainly didn't release any statement. You would think one of the main sticking points in a meeting between the member of the JVP and a member of the Indian government should be devolution of power in the 13th Amendment, something that the JVP even recently has said they are not for the 13th Amendment. And that, I think, is a good way for me to also just kind of talk about, you mentioned sovereignty, right? It was a buzzword previously. I want to suggest to your audience that this is still, sovereignty, the issue is still a prime move in Sri Lankan politics. I know that this election, more than any other, will be mainly about the economy, but I just want to give people this understanding that I think if you're watching this program, it's an English program. If you're watching it at home on Newsfirst, you might be from a certain socioeconomic background, and certainly the economy will be your number one issue that you probably think should dominate the election. But if you look at Sri Lanka's politics over the last 20 years, sovereignty has played a big part in this. And I think if you extend the word sovereignty a little bit, you can go into other words like nationalism, like control, like having agency in your own affairs. So I think when you take these concepts together and you see the steady deterioration of Sri Lanka's governance, and you see the nationalism, the ultra-nationalism that came up from the 2019 election, I think you can see that the Sri Lankan polity and the electorate are always ready to move on this issue of sovereignty. And I think it comes down to, I just want to remind the audience of a comment made by President Barack Obama when he was a candidate in 2018. He made a comment related to the Republican electorate in the US and said, you know, they are only interested in clinging to guns and religion. So I think what he's trying to say is that when you forego some kind of understanding of the material benefits of policy, you then get stuck into social issues. Now, I don't think that's necessarily a negative or a positive, but in Sri Lanka, for instance, the economy has for so long been on the back burner because we've had all these threats, shall we say, to our sovereignty, whether it's from the LTT, which was an explicit threat to the territorial integrity of the country, whether it's from the UNHRC, which is a political threat. This is all about control. It's about...
So, Kusum, how close are the words nationalism and sovereignty?
Well, in Sri Lanka's case, Shamir, the problem I see is that Sri Lanka is still a relatively young nation that's had so many external pressures that we haven't really been able to build an inclusive sort of an inclusive idea of what Sri Lankan nationalism is. Our nationalism is always painted by the single Buddhist ultra-nationalist extremism, or there is this push for a very liberal idea of what Sri Lanka should be, that it's multicultural, that it shouldn't be considered Sinhala Buddhist. So I think the Sri Lankan electorate lies somewhere in the middle, where the two parties have always been pulling
If you look at it, in 2019, after the Easter bomb attacks took place, the government that was elected subsequently, the Gotabaya Rajapaksa government, was elected on the card of the nationalistic rhetoric. And if you look at even the statement that President Gotabaya Rajapaksa made after being appointed as the president of the country in Anuradhapura, draws parallels to this. And that is why I'm asking you, right now this is going to be an election year. What sort of rhetoric is going to take center stage? Is it going to be a nationalistic rhetoric? Is it going to be based on sovereignty? Is it about economic victories that we have to achieve? What is it going to be?
Well, I think if you want to link the economic issue with sovereignty, we can. I think there is a very important conversation to be had there about how much control we're going to have over our fiscal operations, how much control we'll have over our economy, trade deals, you know, all that's a very interesting topic as well. But I think I would never discount straight pure sovereignty as being, if it's not number one, it'll always be number two in Sri Lanka, because the majority of Sri Lanka is 85% or 80% rural, right? Most people in Sri Lanka are not going to see a big difference in their lifetimes, nor maybe in their children's lifetime, because that's how far back some parts of Sri Lanka have fallen, right? So when you have nothing else, you cling to guns and religion. And in Sri Lanka, guns and religion means I need to make sure that my culture is represented, that I feel that I am part of a homogeneous Sinhala Buddhist society. And that feeling, I think a lot of opposition parties have always failed to really address. And I hope that in this election, some of the opposition parties do address it.
Thank you very much, Kusum Vijayatilaka. Foreign policy analyst, nice to hear you admit that the NPP is taking some traction as far as elections are concerned. Kusum, coming from the SJB, so I now move my attention towards Udit Devapriya, Chief International Relations Analyst from Factum. Udita, what is sovereignty and why is it important for a country like Sri Lanka? We've had a very, very rich history, and why is it important in today's day and age?
Well, when we talk about sovereignty, broadly there are two aspects to it: popular sovereignty and state sovereignty. In a country like Sri Lanka, sovereignty tends to be expressed in both ways. Sri Lanka, like you said, has a long history, and that long history has been entwined in, and even I would say has been entwined in a series of foreign occupations. When you open a history textbook, what we see are episodes from Sri Lanka's history where the country was colonized by this power or that power. Even before the European colonies, even before the European colonial powers came into scene. So that entire matrix of foreign occupations has very much had an impact on our understanding of sovereignty. One could call it a result of historical trauma, one could call it, one could say that we have defined ourselves in terms of the colonial powers, in terms of the foreign occupations that we have gone through. So from that historical backdrop, what we can say is that sovereignty today in Sri Lanka is understood in pretty much the same terms as it was 30, 40 years ago. What I mean by that is, as Pavitra pointed out very clearly, it's the political aspect: territorial integrity, freedom from external occupation, external intervention. It's that sort of sovereignty that we tend to talk about in Sri Lanka.
Why I'm asking you this question, because you spoke about political interference, political involvement. When you speak about territorial integrity, we see a very strong man of the government, a strong cabinet minister, recently in India went on to say that Sri Lanka is like part of India. We are giving 3 airports to them. This was a very famous statement that was trending on social media as well. And then you tend to wonder what's really happening to Sri Lanka? Are we talking about these little things about territorial integrity anymore? Are we talking about sovereignty anymore? Aren't we all glad? I still recollect when the economic collapse took place, most of the people were saying we should have been a part of Britain. There'll be any time soon that India would take over Sri Lanka. What are your thoughts on
So I'm not too sure whether, when they said that, whether they were meaning that they would prefer Britain taking over Sri Lanka to India taking over Sri Lanka. I'm not too sure about what they actually meant.
These were what were trending at
Yes,
that time on
yes.
social media.
So, I mean, those memes are still there on Facebook. Basically, we would have done better if we were under the British. So, that particular aspect of sovereignty comes out from that other, basically that particular aspect of sovereignty is what some people call popular sovereignty, where people feel they should be in control, the voters feel they should be in control of a country's destiny. And what they decide about the country's destiny should, I mean, the policies that they feel are in the best interests of the country should be the policies that should be implemented by the government of the day, by elected representatives. So what we saw during the Aragale, during the immediate aftermath of the economic crisis, was one form of sovereignty, popular sovereignty, superseding another. At least that's how I see it, because like you correctly said, no one was talking about national security. No one was talking about territorial integrity at the time. Everyone was concerned about gas queues, fuel queues, miles-long queues for petrol and diesel. So much so that they all rallied together and walked to Galle Face. So at that particular moment, yes, they were talking about sovereignty when they were, paradoxically, when they said that they would have preferred Britain taking over the country, they were talking about one form of sovereignty. They were talking about, they were seeing themselves as the controllers of the nation's destiny, and they felt betrayed by the government of the day. You must understand that a lot of the protests, a lot of the anger at the government stemmed not from what they saw as the government's democracy deficit, but what they saw as the government's incompetence. The government simply was not able to ensure them basic necessities. It's not because they were, well, at least a vast majority of them were not concerned about basic legal issues, constitutional issues concerning the government. They were more concerned about getting their next meal. And like someone once said recently, there's no greater danger to a government of a country than your typical mother and father who are unsure about getting the next plate of rice for their child. When they are uncertain about that next plate of rice, they feel they have nothing to lose. And that is what we saw during the Aragale. I mean, there was a recent video of a US diplomatic official who likened that to riots in the street, a prominent US diplomat. There was a backlash against that video because many people felt that he was basically comparing the Aragale and the Aragalistas to a mob. That anger was justifiable because the anger on the streets, which that diplomat likened to a mob,
Right.
was basically born out of a particular, I would say, perception and understanding of sovereignty. It was sovereignty, they were basically debating sovereignty out in the streets. It's just not the sovereignty that we talk about when we say territorial, when we talk about territorial integrity or national security. It was a different form of sovereignty, but it was very much relevant to that particular period in our country's history as well.
Do you think that people in Sri Lanka would go back to something of that sort if things are not arrested? Because we see cost of living going up, people are losing jobs. Do you see that people would demand for that kind of sovereignty in the next few months?
What do you mean by that sort of sovereignty?
Now you spoke about the Aragale and
Yes.
all of that.
Well, right now, opinion is divided in a very subtle way between those who think that there's stability in the country and those who think that this stability is deceptive and fragile. Between those who think, to quote that US diplomat's own words, that we are the greatest comeback story in the region versus we are still down there in the hole. We haven't gone out of that hole. So compared to the Gotabaya Rajapaksa era, there's obviously much anger on the streets out there. There's actually much popular mobilization against this government. But this particular form of sovereignty that I mentioned, popular sovereignty, I believe it's very much there, which is why we are seeing recent developments like a mass surge of support for particular political formations, not just anger at the government, but also anger at various institutions, organizations, and civil society outfits, which are basically peddling narratives of which are basically supportive of the economic ideology that is being implemented by the government.
Right.
In terms of debt restructuring, in terms of SOE privatizations. So in conclusion, I would say yes, that form of sovereignty, that form of popular anger is still very much relevant.
Right. Thank you very much, Udit, the Chief International Relations Analyst from Factum. I now move my attention towards Dr. Harinder Vidanage from the Kotalawal Defence University. Harinder, just a couple of weeks ago, we celebrated our 76th Independence Day in Sri Lanka with much pomp and pageantry. Dr. Pavitra spoke about how important independent decision-making, independent choices to be made when it comes to sovereignty. 76 years down the line, is Sri Lanka independent anymore with its decision-making?
To answer that question, Shamir, I think we should go to the actual heart of today's discussion, which is on geopolitics. Because I think what happens is, we as Sri Lankans, we prefer to talk about our sovereignty and all these things, and we forget the fact that we are talking about our sovereignty because of the geopolitical transformations that we are living in. So just to put it into context, why are we even talking about geopolitics? Because geopolitics is a damned word and a concept. People, the problem with geopolitics, what people don't realize is the moment we have a world which is in what we call in the geopolitical mode, it destabilizes the established norms of governance, international relations, cooperation, and then it has a drastic cascading effect on everyone, everything, which I'll explain in a second. So basically, last year, with the height of the Ukraine-Russia conflict and Gaza, the American Secretary of State finally, in an address to Stanford University, acknowledged that the world that we lived in, that world even the Americans believed that we lived in, is over. Which means what we call the post-Cold War world was over. And now the problem for the United States and most other countries is what is coming next. So what I'm trying to tell you is how the big powers see the world changing. So they see a world that is in transition, which was pretty much in their control, withering away. But most of them are not sure what's coming. The best example, the closest example I can give you is the recently concluded Munich Security Conference, which is the world's largest gathering of security from tier 1 to tier, all. Its report this time came as lose-lose. It comes with a title. The report was lose-lose. What did you mean lose and lose? It basically meant that even the countries which strongly believed in this status quo, believed in mutual gains, believed in international cooperation, is losing faith on that. So countries are pursuing what we call relative gains. So a geopolitical moment is a moment that kind of, is a catalyst for decoupling, catalyst for deglobalization instead of globalization, catalyst for what we call more centralized power plays, catalyst for minilateralism rather than multilateralism. So we find as a country in Sri Lanka, as a small state, what we call small state, globally in one of the most difficult situations, because the world has entered a geopolitical mode when the order is somewhat ruptured, which means most of the countries which think they can gain something are trying to use the geopolitical approach to do international relations. What I mean by a geopolitical approach is, look at the way the Americans have been dealing with China. Look at the way, even Russia has been dealing with Ukraine. China has been, interacting with India. So what we are entering is a timeline which we had not seen in the past 50 years, which is a return, we call the return of geopolitics. And based on that interaction, how countries like us will survive and will thrive is based on the decisions we make in our country. Sadly, I once also said the foreign policy mantra of domestic policy as an extension of the foreign policy might change, because more we are going into on a geopolitically destabilized world, geopolitically oscillated world, what is coming from external will have a major impact on what we do here, irrespective of who is in power, who's going to come to power. So that is a challenge smaller states are facing. So because what we are, it's not geopolitics, it's what we call geo-everything. Now technology is seen as geotechnology, economy is seen as geoeconomics. Now things like a chip, a microprocessor, which is the heart of all the technology, is now part of what we call critical technologies. Countries are fighting over the control of who makes chips and not. Countries are cutting supply chains, right? The countries are bringing in laws that dismantles the logistic, the routes, the connectivity that has been there. So for a country like Sri Lanka, which is in not the best economic situation, which is not in the best politically stable situation, which is neighboring probably the fastest growing economy on earth, which is India, which probably will stay at 6% next year, which is sitting on $600 billion of reserves, which has significant regional and global ambitions. So we have to be very realistic and strategic about how we look at our region and the world.
Yeah, so Harinder, you brought in a very important point about the Munich Security Conference, which was held just a couple of days ago between the 18th to the 20th in Munich. So they focused on many issues. They spoke about the European Union, they spoke about the crisis in Gaza, they spoke about the Russian-Ukraine conflict. Those were on the key agenda, but not forgetting the fact they all spoke about the rise of new power centers, particularly in Asia, and the implications of global stability with a focus on the rise of China and in particular India. Now look at where Sri Lanka is. We are sandwiched in between these two countries.
This is what I'm saying. So if we are to make decisions about India in the same way we looked at India 10 years ago,
that's not the way to go about
it. We are anyway lost. One of the biggest problems we had in foreign policy as well as our academic culture is we never understood India properly, and we had a view of India which was not India. So the problem for the West is also West admires India, but West is also very cautious because now the Indians are called the 21st century swing state, right? Which means India is not going to follow the same line, the geopolitical interests of the geopolitical West. Right? It is what we call pursuing, once also we had this conversation, what we call strategic autonomy. Now going beyond that, India is kind of seen as this swing state, which does business the way it deems is best for its interest. And it is shaping its own view of the region as well as the world, which, and it's also having aggressive policy of economic diffusion, security. I agree with Pavitra about the critical geopolitics and all this, but the problem with hardcore power geopolitics is that when it's up, the destructive nature of geopolitics is anybody who is the leader of a country who's living in a geopolitical moment is forced to look at the world in a very narrow viewpoint.
So you speak about India, Harinder. I just want to pick your brain on this, because we saw how Narendra Modi was appointed as the Prime Minister of India on the 26th of May 2014. We saw the previous Congress rule in the Indian government as well. We didn't see very much big strides forward. But in the last 10 years, as you correctly mentioned, there seemed to be a very dominant India playing center stage. You see when it comes to AI, when it comes to engagement, when it comes to statements that are being released in the Indian media or even outside, we see a dominant India playing a role. Why is that?
India in the last 10 years probably a lot of the thing. I think India was in transition anyway. It was even before Modi. The last few probably years of Manmohan Singh, you know, even the Congress saw the potential of India. India probably is the youngest nation on earth, demographically. And I think what it has done is it has, you know, successfully plugged itself into the larger geo-technological ecosystem. Indians are advocating Silicon politics. Some people argue that is the ability to create technological capabilities without relying on China, which is very parallel to what the Americans now call clean technology, which is, you know, dividing Chinese technology to create this new arc of technological dominance. And the other reason why that is happening is the BJP. If you go back and look at all BJP manifestos, though it has its, you know, deviances, the science-based and the entrepreneurship. If you look at India's, you know, IMF forecast for India, they say probably post this election, the private sector will invest more in India, their own private sector. And they're so confident of the growth in India, as well as the way, you know, how Indians have integrated their conglomerates, their business, you know, corporate vision with a political vision, and the way India has also articulated its foreign policy.
Right. Right.
These are all things that I think, so from a Sri Lankan perspective, rather than talking about what sovereignty we can have, I mean, we have to have I think a strategic view of sovereignty,
Right.
not a emotional view of sovereignty.
Dr. Pavitra, and bringing in another factor, which is that we have globally more elections happening this year than any other year in history. More people are going to vote this year, more than 2 billion, I believe, are voting this year in more than 75 different elections. So nobody really knows who's going to be in power in many of these countries, including the United States, come November when they have their presidential election. Are we in Sri Lanka aware of this to a sufficient extent?
I think we can be more aware of it for sure. Why? Because, as Dr. Harinder said, it's imperative that you know, what is happening in the structure would affect us. It's imperative. And what we get to see in the world is that the entire world is sort of in a global crisis in terms of, you know, economic prospects and political chaos and, you know, stuff like that, the Palestine issue, the Ukraine issue, and you know, migration issues that, you know, so-called democratic countries are facing in the Europe. So people are not happy. It's not just people in Sri Lanka. People across the world, you know, generally speaking, are not happy. And the response that they are going to give will shape by the fact that, you know, this unhappiness, that they would often think that it's a result of the failure of most of the democratic, you know, governance practices. And likely that, you know, in most of, I mean, this could be an overgeneralization, but, you know, there's this trend of, you know, far right movements are picking up in most of the countries that are so-called democratic countries as well, including USA, right? So I think that will definitely shape the structure, the global structure, giving those leaders legitimacy to make popular decisions instead of, you know, sustainable and democratic decisions. And those actions and reactions will definitely impact us because we are in the periphery. The main difference between a country like Sri Lanka and a superpower is that, you know, our material capability is definitely, you know, different, and we should be understood in a different context.
But where should we as Sri Lanka position ourselves in this state of flux which is happening around the world, both due to elections and due to conflicts? What is our best course of action, keeping in mind the sovereignty of our people?
Yeah, so I think our course of action should be fundamentally shaped by the fact that what our people want and the sense of, you know, the understanding of the world in a bigger picture. You know, who might be the superpower, the you know, capabilities of superpowers. You know, how the power centers are being changed, and the power of technology. You know, we might have some unused geopolitical relevance that we can focus and highlight more, and we are too much hanged on this traditional way of understanding geopolitics as well, instead of picking sides, probably a completely different view about how we should be going is necessary. But then again, it goes back to the fact that who will do that? We are still in the we are a country that who claimed for a system change, being within the system. So so that is the dilemma here. Would we have fresh eyes to see the world? Do we have this collaboration between different stakeholders to understand each other? I mean, I would usually think that we are a country who we don't know about each other that much, ethnic wise, the class wise, the gender wise, and we don't know each other. So that might be a big challenge to understand what our people want, and also this consciousness about the world politics, the technology impact in the world politics, military capabilities of the world politics.
Niresh, to be very precise, there are 64 elections this year, and 49% of the population in the world will be going for elections in 2024, which is a very, very crucial year anywhere globally.
Does 64 include our election?
I don't know.
because to a lot of people, it's up in the air.
I wish it's included, and I hope and pray it's included as well. I want to get back to Harinder. Harinder, you spoke about India, and I just want to go back several decades. Let's go back to 1955, where the non-aligned movement was formed by India and Yugoslavia as one of the principal countries. And then if you look at Egypt, also played a key role. Now, at that time, the objective was, or the focus was, to ensure that peace cannot be achieved with separation, but with the aspiration towards collective security in global terms and expansion of freedom, as well as terminating the domination of one country over another. Now, India was the founding members of the non-aligned movement in the world. But today, that policy seems to have slipped away. Now, when it comes to a country like Sri Lanka, we are being told, or forcefully told, to pick a side, whether it's India or whether it's going to be China. Why is that? Is that fair? Now, can we as a country pick a side? And now we are in somewhat of a dilemma, aren't we?
And also, is NAM, the non-aligned movement, relevant anymore?
Non-aligned movement in its non-aligned 1.0 is not. The idea of non-alignment is very relevant because it has kept most even India, though I mean, India is still sticking to that value system. Non-alignment was about opposing. Non-alignment is ideological. That is the difference between it and neutrality. Because neutrality is event-based. We take Russia-Ukraine conflict. We can be neutral on Russia-Ukraine conflict. Non-alignment is a stance that we say, okay, the United States and Russia are at a power play. We will interact with both of you, but we would not encourage or be part of anything that you two do against each other to achieve a certain political objective. That is non-alignment. So non-alignment as a movement served the newly independent countries in the 1950s, which were not as not in this this 50 years on, they have matured. Some countries have fallen out, some countries have weakened, most countries have matured. I mean, of course, though we have our criticisms globally, I think if you look at the world, countries have progressed. If you look back at poverty figures 10 years back and poverty figures now, there's a drastic drop, right? So the world has progressed. The world has the countries have developed. Looked at you can look at East Asia, look at from Vietnam to so countries have progressed. So this idea about non-alignment is, that's what I'm saying, it is a more sustained ideological view about how you address dominant geopolitical power rivalries. It was the way for many countries to navigate power rivalries. But the problem with geopolitics is geopolitics you know, if you look at 50 years ago, it was the US Soviet kind of competition for a world which was ideologically to be shaped in the worldview of these two countries. But geopolitics is not about that ideological shaping. Geopolitical is more short-term gains about who grabs power in any means necessary. That is why you see, for example, our region, Indian Ocean, becoming one of the most militarized ocean systems in the world. Because, so in that kind of a situation, how Sri Lanka is going to survive may need, it still need the fundamentals of non-alignment. But I think,
can we pick a side?
No, that's the thing. I mean, this is the most unpopular thing. You know, people, probably, you know, I'm a strategist. So from a strategic perspective, in 5 years' time, not today, we might be able, we might be forced to pick a side.
Because we saw this between 2009
we might be.
to 2015 when the Mahinda Rajapaksa administration was in power. It was very clear we were picking sides.
No,
but
I think
since 2015, that has changed.
It has changed, but that external condition and the external condition that is going to come are totally different.
Right. So I'm getting a lot of questions from our viewers today on this subject. So I just want to quickly move to Kusum. Kusum, now interestingly, on the 9th of January this year, President Ranil Wickremesinghe decided to send a ship to fight Houthi rebels in the Red Sea. Just a couple of days after, Niresh, I see President Ranil Wickremesinghe agreeing to fund the United Nations of $1 billion for the children in Gaza. So now I'm trying to figure out what is the policy of the Ranil Wickremesinghe administration.
Is it a non-aligned policy or?
I don't know. I'm trying to figure it out because 9th of January he says he wants to send a petrol. Now he says that the cabinet has approved $1 million to the UN to support the victims in Gaza.
Yeah, but Shamir, I think he would make the statement that, you know, on one side he's sending the ship to protect global shipping and commercial shipping. But on the other side, he will say he has always been consistent that the Palestinian cause must be supported. And Sri Lanka has done that rhetorically. I think at the United Nations, even at the recent ceasefire resolution, Sri Lanka voted for a ceasefire. So in that sense, he will just say that these are not two things that are mutually exclusive to each other, that we can do both.
But there seems to be a very distorted light. Now we say there sometimes is a red light, there is a green light, there is an amber light.
Yeah.
But now it seems to be a distorted light. I'm trying to figure out what color it is.
Shami, these are international issues, right? So if you think about foreign policy, just yesterday our foreign minister made a statement that Sri Lanka's economy is 0.000 something 1% of the global economy and there is nothing to exploit, etc. So this is coming from Sri Lanka's foreign minister. But all we hear from the foreign ministry is generally about Sri Lanka's geostrategic location, the shipping lanes, the importance of being in India's sphere of influence, the Chinese footprint on the island. So it's clearly, there's two sides to this, and the government hasn't picked one. And even the rhetoric is sort of showing that, right? Because it's almost bipolar, if you think about it. Now, I want to just bring the conversation back since we brought in India, and you mentioned Yahapalne, right? And you mentioned the Gotabaya victory. Before the Gotabaya victory, it was the local government elections in 2018 that government won. So we know for one thing that the economy wasn't great under Yahapalne. We know the bond scam happened. But another thing happened before that 2018 election, and that was Sri Lanka's co-sponsorship of the UN HRC resolution. I think it was resolution 215, it may have been. And this resolution explicitly called for foreign judges as part of Sri Lanka's accountability process. Now, getting back to this point I made about sovereignty and control, this was something that I looked at that time as well, because this co-sponsoring was a very controversial thing because 2016. So leading up to that, we have always been about, we have made a commitment, we will honor that commitment. Now it's true that several governments didn't stick to a single commitment when it came to LLRC and the Paranagama Commissions, etc. But the fact of the matter is to go from that to co-sponsoring a resolution, understanding that the resolution says foreign judges in a localized tribunal or justice operation, that's clearly a problem when it comes to sovereignty. That's clearly an intervention in a local
But that
system.
changed in 2019 when the Gotabaya Rajapaksa administration came to power. They
Yes.
said that they won't go ahead co-sponsoring the resolution, and they made themselves very clear, because Sri Lanka predominantly, Kusum, has not had a bipartisan policy when it comes to our foreign policy.
Right.
We've seen foreign policies changing overnight when new governments come into play.
Right. So my point with the 30th Amendment is, I've always seen the 30th Amendment as something of an Indian export to Sri Lanka. And I've seen that
No,
it's
but
a very
yeah.
easy, it's a very
Let- let-
easy
yeah,
thing for
just-
the ultranationalists to jump on and say that, 30th, and now let's take a look at the new ITEC leaders' comments on federalism. In fact, even at the start of this government, I think it was Gajendra Kumar, the Member of Parliament, the Honourable Gajendra, who spoke about going beyond the 30th Amendment and onto federalism. Now, if this is the rhetoric from the mainstream Tamil parties in Sri Lanka, you can quite clearly see that the ultranationalist movement has an opening here.
Yeah, but
Right.
the point is Kusum. Now, Harinder said we have to pick a side ultimately in the future. And if you look at it, we have to be on the side of India because
Yeah.
when we were in different dire straits, India came up with that $3.5 billion US dollar package. Where was China at this time?
I agree, Shamir, but
we
I
were,
think
we were in limbo, and this Jayashankar also, the Minister of External Affairs in India, said our package is much bigger than the IMF package. IMF is only agreeing for $2 billion.
I'll just push back
and
a bit
we
on
paid him $3.5 billion.
I'll push back a bit on Mr. Jayashankar. I think a lot of there's no question, right? Sri Lanka is afloat because of India. There's no question about that because of as soon as the crisis happened. But let's remember that of that $3 or $4 billion that Mr. Jayashankar is alluding to, some of that was an Indian credit line, right? So we are getting credit from India to buy goods from India. And let's face it, complete government, societal, economic failure in Sri Lanka on the southern tip of India is not good for India either, right? There is also a large ethnic minority in Sri Lanka that have co-ethnics in South India. So that's also something to worry about. So I think from that sense, it makes sense. India has to support Sri Lanka. When it comes to picking a side.
But there is nothing saying India has to support Sri Lanka there.
But I think when it comes to 30th Amendment, Shamir, what's important is that India believes that the Tamil people in Sri Lanka have the right to self-determination. I think most of us around this table probably agree with the same thing.
But 13th Amendment to the Constitution, Kusum, came in after 86, what happened in 85, 86.
So
you
I
saw
suppose,
the Timbu talks
I suppose my
happening
point is
because of the fact that the northern peninsula was
yes,
not
so I
getting
think,
food, so India dropped
my point
food,
is that if
so
we
that's the
are
history,
to,
right?
I think
Let's
we
not
should
forget that.
I think we should look at the 30th Amendment and understand that it's not the only route to devolution. And as long as we keep plugging along with this 30th Amendment, and as long as you have a Tamil majoritarian, the mainstream Tamil parties talking about going beyond the 30th Amendment and onto federalism, I think it leaves an open for the ultranationalist movement, and I think that's where a lot of the liberal parties seem to fail with our election.
So Javed, I'm going to take some questions from our viewers because I'm getting a whole heap of questions and then some comments also. So let me take one question for you now. What do you think the future of the newly forming Sri Lankan government have to keep whether the non-aligned concept in their foreign policy? If there was a new government in play, are they supposed to keep the non-aligned concept in their foreign policy?
Yeah, I'll answer that question in the course of my remarks because I have a clear view on that. But, if you look at what has been discussed and the national conversation going about how successful Sri Lanka has been since we gained independence, I think one of the success stories is our foreign policy. We have had bad patches, but overall 75 years our foreign policy has done well. Now, you asked me this question about non-aligned and all that.
Javed, I'm just trying to be the pessimist I am.
No,
tell me the time that Sri Lanka's foreign policy was good. We saw ACS Hamid, we saw Lakshman Kadiragama, but apart from that, tell me.
Well, I think during the Bandaranaike's time, we had the respect of the world. There was a time.
Even in 2015, we had the respect of the world when Maithripala Sirisena was elected as the president of the country, because I was at the United Nations General Assembly that year I saw the manner in which how world leaders came and spoke to President Maithripala Sirisena.
Yeah,
Whether or not
but
he did a good job, that's
no,
the question at the end of the day.
Yeah,
But that's not an indicator. That's very subjective.
That's not an indicator in that sense, maybe. But what I'm trying to say is at certain stages. Now, I would say that the 80s, you know, that unfortunate comparison by Mr. President Jayawardena about the Indian leadership and our Sri Lankan leadership may have paved the way for what happened thereafter in terms of, you know, giving some kind of sanctuary to the LTT and the IPKF and the Indo-Sri Lanka agreement and all that. But whether it directly contributed or not, certainly there was bad blood at that time. So, but you know, I am harking back to the Bandaranaike's time particularly, because there was a time when we led the non-aligned world, that when Sri Lanka spoke, the world listened. We had the moral high ground, and that was based on one factor. That is, I think we took positions on basis of what the country felt right, because we were not tied bound by any alignments. In a sense, what South Africa is doing today. Why would South Africa go to the International Court of Justice and argue on behalf of the people of Gaza, except because they genuinely feel that it is a cause worth espousing? And Sri Lanka did that in many ways. That is why Sri Lanka was able to even the Simla Accords between China and India. And we could get many things from India at that time by our goodwill. And if you recall, I mean, these are well known to all of them, that when Bangladesh was breaking away from Pakistan, despite Sri Lanka having very good relations with Pakistan and very good relations with India, India did not want to give Pakistani planes which were going to East India landing rights to refuel. Sri Lanka gave, and India was not happy. But they recognized it and they accepted it because we were friends. They did not doubt our bona fide. So I think our foreign policy has to be shaped in that way. Now, coming back to you asking about non-alignment, I'm not sure now whether we are following non-alignment or what. Because
so we have another question. I was going to link that question also, Javed. In light of the president's stance on Israel and Gaza, is Sri Lanka still non-aligned, or has it become non-directional?
Yeah, so what I'm saying is...
You mean like the Titanic?
No, I have...
At least the Titanic had a destination.
I have heard government spokesmen at different times claiming that Sri Lanka's foreign policy is non-aligned. Other times they have been saying we are multi-aligned. I don't know what that means, but I've heard both this. So that clearly shows that they are not sure where they are going. Now, with regard, now take the question of Gaza. Gaza is a hot topic. It's a monument of injustice where civilians are being harmed. I have not seen a single statement from the government of Sri Lanka condemning the civilian massacre in Gaza. It's true what you said, that in the General Assembly they supported a ceasefire. In that herd, definitely they went along saying we want a ceasefire. But they have never ever named Israel, blamed Israel by name for doing this harm. Now, this comes back to the other question, the other aspect of foreign policy, where you have to look after your own citizens. Now, you know, we have a large section of migrant workers, mainly women, about 65% are women, working the Gulf. Now, at one point when the armed conflict was going on, the remittances that they were sending to Sri Lanka was equivalent to what we were spending on the war. So, in effect, they were funding the war, despite all their difficulties. Now, today remittances are coming from the Middle East, is one of the, how do you say, money that is helping the country to economically to keep going.
Keep ourselves afloat.
Afloat. But look at this business of us sending people to work in Israel. We are sending them to the hotspot where the government of Sri Lanka, forget the government of Sri Lanka, even the Israeli government will not be able to guarantee their safety. And we have a classic case parallelly going on, at least from that we should learn. See what has happened in Myanmar,
Right.
where our people have been trapped in an area, and the government, of course, it's very difficult for the government to get them out. But knowingly, why are we sending these people to work in Israel?
So I'm trying to get as quick as.
Let me just
yeah.
ask Dr.
Can I ask a question of Udita and come back to you? Udita has been silent a little bit for the last few minutes. As per Article 3, the sovereignty is in the people and it's inalienable. The question from our viewer is the people's sovereignty threatened by other countries, or is it from the executive itself, disregarding Supreme Court directions and Constitutional Council processes in appointment of key personnel?
Well, in terms of perceptions, and I think at the end of the day, constitutions and laws have a big say on what sovereignty is and how people look at it, but perceptions matter as well. My answer to that would be external interventions intruding on people's sovereignty is much less important than, or much less significant than internal intrusions on sovereignty. What do I mean by that? Well, let's look at it this way. We are talking about geopolitics, and we are a small state, and as a small state, as a small and relatively fragile state, we are hemmed in by various geopolitical pressures. So this is a two-way process whereby, on the one hand, these geopolitical pressures lead to certain cascading effects on the economic front which impact us very negatively. This happened after the Russia-Ukraine war, this happened in Sri Lanka. So that leads to various pressures on the electoral front whereby Sri Lankans feel that they are occupying a shrinking electoral space. So you have these external factors like the Russia-Ukraine war having a cascading effect on Sri Lanka, and the next thing we know, Sri Lankans feel that they are being constrained on the economic front, on the political front, and they feel that it's the failure of the state that has led to this shrinking space. So they don't necessarily look at it from the point of view of the Russia-Ukraine war impacting their sovereignty in terms of their right to exercise that sovereignty. They feel that it is the powers that be in Sri Lanka which has shrunk that political space. So when they are looking for a scapegoat in the room, when they are blaming and accusing someone of actually shrinking their sovereignty, and basically when they are, how shall I put it, when they are basically undermining their sovereignty, they will always look at the government they elected rather than those external pressures. The external pressures will always have a bearing on sovereignty, but the people of Sri Lanka will always look at the government of the day and the failures of the state as the main reason for those pressures and for the colossal mismanagement.
Just as you were talking, there was another question from viewer. Citizen sovereignty in Sri Lanka is highly theoretical. A large portion vote for the candidate giving electoral bribes such as alcohol, fried rice and rupees 1,000.
The bath packet and the arak bottle.
What about
that's okay.
the chickens and chicks and all that?
Well, that has been part of Sri Lanka's political culture for a long time, because people don't just come in buses to attend rallies for no reason. They are not altruistic. They come there with the expectation of being favored should the party that they elect and help elect to power, they come with the expectation of getting benefits from that particular government or that from that particular party.
But is that the surrendering of sovereignty to a particular political party?
That's a bit of a tricky question. I would say it is, because it's an undermining of sovereignty. We are actually yielding place to the government of the day in the hopes of getting benefits. in the longer term, that has a very detrimental impact on sovereignty, but in the shorter term, that tends to be seen as an entitlement. You support you support a particular party, you help it get to power, and you expect benefits from it in terms of recruitments to the public sector, in terms of recruitments to this particular agency or that particular institution, in terms of getting bribes, in terms of getting favorizations on favors from other parts, from other aspects. What they fail to realize is that in the longer term, this does have a detrimental impact on sovereignty, but in the shorter term, it's seen as an entitlement. Whether or not people have come to the realization that this culture should be gotten rid of is, of course, it remains to be seen.
Yeah. So, Harinder, if you look at the world, there are 33 ongoing disputes between UN member states and observer states for territory. Sri Lanka could be looked as one of the countries that has been able to successfully defeat the LTTE, who are fighting for territory in the world. But sovereignty at that time was the topic. But don't you think sovereignty now is a very subjective term?
That's because I think the way like as an earlier comment about the theoretical aspect, even down to the constitution, we are standing as long as the rules-based order is intact. If the rules-based order crumbles, we come into the street and demanding for sovereignty will make no. That means that of course the state has a responsibility, but if the system is in a what we call a systemic shock or a collapse, it's hard. So, but I think I like what Javed was referring to. Sri Lanka was facing, in the 70s, 80s, also the time of heightened pressure, Cold War pressure, and we managed to
maneuver our way.
To maneuver. So, but the problem is, one of the biggest challenges in international affairs and explaining about international affairs is to tell people how the time and space context has radically shifted. And the India we are talking about is a different India. The China we are talking about is a different China, as well as the way the system is functioning. So because I'm more biased towards international affairs as through discipline, and also strategically I'm trying to understand, because countries, it's important we have the debate about the sovereignty internally, but it is also we have to be very realistic and strategic about how far can we hold that together. And when we see significant transitions happening in the region and the world, one of the mistakes we did was we never read it properly. So we have been trying to address certain regional and global challenges in a very narrowed down version. So it's like the questions we raise about, for example, the visit of the NPP leadership to India, things like that. But we, I'm okay. It's a question, but the way we try to explain it and to understand it is, I think we are sometimes thinking like, we are thinking our strategic thinking is in the analog age when the things have moved to a digital sphere. So and some of these, strategic thinking is very unpopular. Strategic thinking is very unemotional and it's very unethical. That is what survival of a state has always relied, not just purely on, on moral grounds, but the states have to make very difficult decisions, and that's how countries have steered. Because we are living at a time when so many sovereignties are in question and in crisis, right? So I think last month President Trump on election trail said, I don't care if Russia bombs a European country which is in the NATO alliance, which the Americans are now. If that country has not put the 2% they should be putting into NATO alliance. So if that is the view of Donald Trump, if he wins the US election, probably, it's going to be a very different view. So
no, but the US, if you look at it, Donald Trump can say anything in the campaign trail.
Yeah.
But the implementation of those policies solely depend on the policies. Now, if you look at it, Harinder, we all know.
Yeah.
When when Donald Trump was elected president,
Yeah.
he had how much of aspiration? He said he wants to build a wall in Mexico. But did all that materialize?
No, but
these are all populist comments. Populist remarks.
but what we have to understand is Donald Trump.
Now, Donald Trump said, I saw him saying that if he was the president of the United States, he would finish the Russian-Ukraine conflict within 24 hours.
No, this is the point. Those are maybe populist, rhetoric, but he successfully managed to alienate the United States from the NATO alliance. So I think most of the European countries were very weary of the United States. The only consistent policy Donald Trump brought out in the context of geopolitics is the Indo-Pacific.
I can tell you a classic example, Harinder.
Yeah.
Now, Trump wanted to cut down expenses to the United Nations.
Yeah.
When he was elected president.
Yeah.
But it did not happen because he said that he doesn't want to keep spending money on countries. He doesn't want to absolve himself. He wants to move away from all this, but it didn't happen.
No, but I think significantly when it comes to things like security alliances.
He still went ahead as a second speaker at the UN General Assembly every year. The General Assembly met.
No, security alliances were in serious crisis for the United States. I think one of the reasons they are having this war is when the US trying to course correct the mistakes he made, and that is and the NATO expansion is part of that.
So I just want to ask you a question. Yeah. I want to put you on the spot now.
Yeah.
I've always wanted to put you on the spot, but now I'm going to mention it and put you on the spot.
Okay.
Now you said we have to pick a side. Now you are a strategist, right?
Yeah.
If you were to pick a side, who would you pick?
No, the thing is, the difference between strategists and other people is,
It'll be easy to say you'll have to pick a side in the future.
No.
Whose side are you going to be?
Point of,
Who would you advise, the government of the day?
No. When I say pick a side, don't think it's like we go to a cricket match and we pick a side. No, that's not what I call by picking a side.
No, we are not even saying that. Do that.
No, picking a side. I think we observing what's happening, right? What we can see is if we are evolving a foreign policy. This is since you put me on the spot. It's not bad to be unpopular and hated for some time. The foreign policy in the future, at least for the short term, has to have what I call Indian centrality at its heart, right? It's not pro-Indian, so it's not liking India because we are in, you said India.
Is it an economic decision, more or less?
It's about understanding where we are. We are literally located in their sphere of influence.
And they are becoming more and more aware of their position in the region and the world. So it's a two-way thing, and we talked about them exporting 13th Amendment. If somebody can say we are a result of their expulsion as well as the Buddhism as export from India, and we have embraced. We've expelled and we have embraced both. So that's also kind of a controversial statement. But so we have grown up being any small country which is bordering has always said that our security, our defense and security policies were made in the post-independence era fearing India. That is a known thing, right? But for the first time after that, I think we now have to look at India in a very different way, right? It's not embracing India or becoming like diehard fanatics of an Indian nation, but what I say is the Indian centrality in foreign policy would help in a certain short to medium term range for Sri Lanka's stability, survival, and this is what this whole visit about NPP is about, right?
If the JVP can change.
Yeah. India is so strategic. It knew certain resistances that certain groups had who led them, for example, against EDCA. So, a few weeks before they announced EDCA, you have these visits taking place. And then, of course, India has significant commercial and financial interest in Sri Lanka to a certain extent. But Sri Lanka is not a great market. That's why I always say, so I think for India, I think in this larger geopolitical equation, Sri Lanka is very important.
Dr. Pavitra, given the course of geopolitical events over the last year or so, Is Sri Lanka now more important, especially given our location in the Indian Ocean? Because we seem to be getting a lot of visits from warships of, I mean, India, Pakistan, US, UK, Iran, and there's usually some kind of ship from China hovering around. We seem to be getting a lot of attention with this gunboat diplomacy. Is it a global phenomenon that has made us more important?
I think because we are a maritime, state, we can't forget the fact that, that this is also the central idea of geopolitics, that the mainstream idea is that, politics is often shaped by the geographical, circumstances. Now, on one hand, with our size, with where we are located, but also the structural changes that are taking place in the, maritime routes, trade and military ships going around us. I think this was never new. When we were thinking about colonialism period, even we were relevant because of our location. So this is not by any means new, and again it's about how we navigate it. We tend to see that our location as our biggest curse, instead of looking at the potentials that our location is actually bringing up. Of course, it's difficult being a small country in the Indian Ocean, close to India but in separation to India. But as Dr. Harinder also said, I would also tend to think that our approach to India is something that we should revisit. For many reasons, I think improving our relations with India is less harmful than other relations with other states. First of all, because it's a democratic country. We have these narratives in Sri Lanka that India is going to sort of invade us, etc., etc. Well, if India actually wanted to invade us, I think it's a matter of a couple of hours or minutes. We're that close. But what India what has kept India in that position is its democratic character after independence, which I don't think India is want to take a chance of being challenged about. It's a part of its identity. Although with Modi, nationalistic trends are there, etc., etc. But there's a democratic legacy there. So in a way, although our relationship with India is so much dominated with this ethnic lens into it, a fresh approach to India, understanding India as a potential, not a potential power, it is a power now. It has a more global orientation now. That might have challenging effect on us, because I think India is, instead of focusing on South Asia, India is now very much looking at the broader picture. I think it's very imperative to use our location, proximity to India, as well as this, looking at India as a booming economy.
So you're more now advocating that the ethnic lens should be dropped and a more economic and geopolitical lens should be adopted, perhaps?
Well, now see, actually now when we were, Udita was explaining this nicely, that internally we have been, there have been popular narratives that shape our domestic politics, which obviously affected our foreign policy outcomes and choices as well. And one being this ethnic lens. But what we saw during the Aragale period is that people got together for various other reasons, and national security or ethnic issues did not make the topic. I'm not saying that we have 100% peace and we are so reconciled and happy and peaceful, but there's real potential to replace our divisions inside domestically in building up a new identity domestically too.
Yeah, Pavitra, if you look at it, now there is discussions about 2024 national poll in India, and the talk is that Narendra Modi will continue to serve a third term. What after Narendra Modi? Because we know that Amit Shah, who's the Minister of Home Affairs, has been earmarked as the successor for Narendra Modi. So let's say Narendra Modi goes from 2024 up to until 2029, and then he contests 2029 to 2034. Then will the direction of India change?
My understanding of India's direction is that although across their two main parties have various ideologies, in terms of their governance, there has been consistency in terms of their economic policies. I was with one of my friends, doing some reading on their approach on free trade agreements, which is very interesting to see that across different regimes, they had still consistency in terms of their policy. So what we
but the policy has changed now. 10 years, as Harinder said, the last 10 years, we've seen a different India.
Yeah.
I've definitely seen a different India.
That's what I'm going to come to.
I've interviewed ministers from the Narendra Modi administration, and I've seen people coming on board after the Modi administration, people like the Minister of External Affairs in particular. Things have drastically changed. There is no comparison whatsoever.
Shamir,
India 10 years ago is not the India now.
Yeah, my analysis is this: in terms of accumulating the capacity, material capacity, it has been very consistent. Why India could be more arrogant or more, let's say, arrogant, yes, or say more strong in terms of their voice is because before that, when you look at even across regimes in terms of economic capability, they have been working for it, and what you see in the last 10 years is that the pinnacle of it, they just came into that point where they can go out and talk about it confidently.
So Javed, I'm going to ask the same question that I asked Harinder. If you were to pick a side, don't look at me like that, Javed. Don't look at me like that. I love the way that Harinder responded, but you're looking at me as if you're very upset that I asked you that question.
From the national interest point of view, we take no sides. And India, which we have been...
You sound like Ranil Wickremesinghe.
We are discussing...
whose side are you on? He's saying, I'm on Sri Lanka's side.
Pro Sri Lanka.
Yeah. So, what I'm saying is, there is no second word that India has changed, as you said, for the last 10 years. India is growing in economic power, its influence in the world and so on, and we are just by the side of India. So, there are two aspects which I want to emphasize here from, as I said, from the national interest point of view. Because of our very weak economy, the Indian footprint in Sri Lanka is increasing, right? Now, when the Chinese footprint was increasing in Sri Lanka, there was one aspect we had to take note of. That is, when companies from India invest, from China, actually it's the Chinese government which is investing through those. There is no private sector as we know here. But in India, you have a private sector. But the private sector and the big ones who are coming here are very close to the Indian government, and controversially so also. So that's fine. And with regard to India's help in a time of crisis, Sri Lanka has to be eternally grateful. But that does not mean that we have to appease India.
But Javed, the point is, it's very well and good to say we can't pick a side. It's nice to hear these words, very patriotic, Javed. You sound like Ranil Wickremesinghe when you say that we have to be on the side of Sri Lanka. But we are a small nation. We have to pick a side, don't we?
No, I mean, is there a side to pick? When you say pick, are you asking whether in a war between India and China, we have to pick a side? No, you're not asking that, no?
So I'm asking you, let's put it this way, Javed, to make it very much more simpler. India wants to send a submarine to Sri Lanka, China wants to send a submarine to Sri Lanka.
Right.
Which submarine will come and dock at the Hamad report?
So now you bring me to the...
No, I'm making it simple for you, Javed. Now I'm making it very easy for you.
Actually, you came to the correct point. That is exactly what I was coming to. That whether one country or the other wants to infiltrate Sri Lanka and extend its area of...
No, not infiltrate. I'm not talking about infiltration.
Okay. Come and extend their influence in Sri Lanka. It is up to us to have the necessary skills to navigate them, keep the friendship, and say no if it's necessary to say no. But all countries will have to perceive that we are playing fair. We don't have a vested interest in supporting one side or the other. We are looking at it from our point of interest. Even if you do make a wrong judgment in their eyes, we will do the correct thing. And I think that is the skill that now is increasingly Sri Lankan foreign ministry and so on have to bring up, because India, now they are friends and they have helped us, as I said, but as they grow in power, their interests, as any growing power, can change. Their what they want to do may not be what they wanted to do earlier. But we must have the skill as a nation.
But isn't that why it's important to have a bipartisan foreign policy in Sri Lanka?
Yeah, that helps a lot. That helps a lot.
Kusum, I'm not going to ask you which side to pick, Kusum, but what should Sri Lanka do? Because we are sandwiched right now. We want India. Harinder says an Indian centralized policy should be the way forward, and you were nodding in agreement when...
No, let me just quickly. I didn't say Indian centralized policy, but what we say when we frame foreign policies, we have certain centralities that we provide. Like, for example, countries have special relations.
Yeah, so Indian-centric.
Indian... Not again. Indian that when we make certain things, we have this. What is India's sensitivity? So that is called Indians. That is the centrality that we provide it. Now, that doesn't mean in every decision we make, we are going to make India centric. That will mess up all our relations with other countries.
The concept of sovereignty.
Yeah. So that's what I mean. Yeah. Sorry.
Very dependent on where you sit in the world. Now, Ukraine is a sovereign state, but Ukraine's decision to join the NATO alliance is very dependent on its very powerful neighbor, and that's what's gotten it into this trouble in the first place. Sri Lanka is a sovereign nation, but we also sit across from a very powerful nation. So when there is such a big power imbalance, there is a obvious effect on sovereignty. So, and we were talking about India's foreign policy and how it's changed in the last 10 years. Let's think about it the other way. What if India's foreign policy hadn't changed in the last 10 years? What happened between the Mahinda Rajapaksa government part 1 and Mahinda Rajapaksa and the Yahapalne government? We saw a basic tread towards the Chinese orbit. Sri Lanka was essentially looked upon as a Chinese satellite. What was Indian foreign policy doing throughout that 10-year period when China went from virtually a negligible footprint to having a port, control over a man-made island on the western side of Sri Lanka, having all these mega projects, us being dependent on them for our debt restructuring. I mean, if I was an Indian foreign policy analyst in the 2015s, I would have definitely told India, you need to course correct, because you now allowed one of your main rivals who you have a territorial dispute with to come into your sphere of influence and have major footprints on a country where you also have some background in, where you have a history of intervention in. So I think most of us would have looking at this thought, when is India going to wake up to this, right? And maybe in some sense you give the Rajapaksa government some credit. I don't want to use the word credit, but you can see that their strategy was clearly to delay or let's say obfuscate this 13th Amendment issue, bring in China as sort of a bulwark between India to say that, look, now we have a different development partner, we are not only dependent on you, and if you try to push us with the 13th Amendment and devolution of power, then we can always turn to China. And I think India found themselves in a bit of a difficult situation. Now, lo and behold, Sri Lanka's strategy with the Chinese worked a little too well, because we are now sort of stuck in this Chinese orbit. And I think when the Yahapalana government came in, there was, yes, a lot of talk about, shifting the emphasis away from China. But what happened to the Hambantota port under Yahapalana? I mean, there was a 99-year lease given to a Chinese company, right? So in that case, can we really say that there was such a big shift under Yahapalana? Other than the co-sponsorship of the UNHRC resolution.
The government used the Hambantota airport to store rice, paddy.
Yes. So I just think that India has, to a certain degree in the last 15 years, made some mistakes, and now it's course corrected, and by some way I think they've got some of the best people in the foreign policy industry working there. And you can see that their assertiveness is now based on a clarity of purpose, where they are no longer trying to shift between one side or the other. They've realized that, I think they've realized a long time ago, but now they're expressing it. They're expressing the fact that they are a massive economy and they don't want to define themselves based on their alliances. They don't need to be conjoined to one axis or the other. And remember, despite having these long-term relationships with Russia, despite having being now a major defense partner of the United States, it's very comfortable aligning on both sides. So on one side, they have Russian tanks being manufactured in India. On the other side, you also have American, the wings of F-15 fighter jets being manufactured with Tata in India. I think that is commendable, because it's not easy to have those kinds of defense links with two diametrically opposed
questions. So let's wrap up. I want to ask the four panelists, what is the way forward for Sri Lanka? Because we're talking about 76 years of independence. We're talking this year to be a very crucial year in terms of elections. We're talking about debt restructuring, which we are still yet to speak about openly, and talk about what is going to be China's role in terms of our debt restructuring process. How is India going to help Sri Lanka in the future, in the next 5 years? So I want to ask the four panelists, what is the way forward for Sri Lanka? Please keep in mind this is going to be an election year. Niresh, let's be optimistic at least.
I am. Eternally so.
Election. So let's start off with Javed. Javed, what is the way forward for Sri Lanka? What must we do as a nation now?
Well, what we do will also depend on what the people want to do. So clearly the people have to make correct decisions. Whatever has gone wrong in the past, the people also are complicit in that, because they made wrong choices. So therefore, I mean, the way forward I can suggest in my own way of thinking, but whether that is workable, it remains to be seen. First, people have to identify the issues, identify the people and the policy. And here this is important. The policy is critical. And will those policies, if you identify as good for the country, will the people espousing those policies, can we rely on them to change, to implement those policies? And there are a lot of other things to be done which cannot be done before the election. For instance, which should have been done a long time ago. Crucial, in my view, is the abolition of the executive presidency. I will end by referring to something that came up earlier, where you asked, how does Araga and sovereignty link up? Now, some people who are critical of the Araga layer say, they created havoc, took the law into their own hands and chased the elected president out of office. Well, the people had no other choice, because the constitution did not provide a way for their loss of confidence in the leader of the country to be addressed, which you can do under the Westminster system. There can be an orderly change. If the Prime Minister and the Cabinet lose the confidence of the country, the members of parliament move a no confidence motion and move out.
The manner in which Winston Churchill came into
Yeah, so so you see, so if so these are things which have to be identified, and it is up to the political leaders to identify this, present it to the people, convince them that they are going to implement.
And we see even this happening in Australia as well, where respective prime ministers change based on the confidence of the parliamentarians at the end of the day.
Yeah, because that is critical. No, now we don't. Now see, we are supposed to, this government under President Ranil Wickremesinghe, what is the mandate they are implementing? According to the chairman of the UMP, they are implementing a mandate of the people, which the UMP presented to the people, and it was rejected. But they are implementing that mandate. So then there are questions, how I don't know whether to use the word legitimate or not, because the power and the policies that the government in office implements have to be drawn from the mandate received from the people. So there are a lot of confusing aspects in the political scene. It's very difficult to...
Sri Lanka's political scene, of course, Javed, confusing always, no?
No, I don't think as bad as this. If you go back 25 years ago or 20 years ago, the lines of demarcation were clear. You had the rightist party, you had the left party, you had the middle path party, and people voted for better or for worse. Now, can you identify on which side anybody is? A person who is supposed to be in an alliance today here is in another alliance somewhere else tomorrow. You know,
I mean, why is it that parliamentarians are resigning?
That I don't know, but that's another important aspect of the Westminster system. When a parliamentarian wants to change sides, if he is a member of the government, he is disappointed with the government, or if he is in the opposition disappointed, he gets up in parliament and makes a statement why he is going to cross over. Either he resigns or he is crossing over to the other side. Now you see the people who are crossed over, they go to the other side and say that they are still member of the original party because they want to retain the seat when they go to the Supreme Court. So it's a mockery of democracy that we have.
Thank you very much, Javed Yusuf, attorney at law. Pavitra Jayawardhan, Dr. Pavitra Jayawardhan from the University of Colombo.
Yeah, so what I will be thinking is that the conditions of the world is radically changing in terms of, you know, its conditions and factors. But we seem to be carrying all these big terms with ancient meanings to it: sovereignty, geopolitics, or citizens. But actually speaking, empirically, when you look at the world is changing. Migration has, you know, changed the world a lot. Fixity of, you know, certain, you know, nation states is now challenged by the transnational, you know, blocks of people. You know, you don't have to be residing in one country to shape its politics anymore. You can be, you know, in some other country but shaping another country's politics. That is what is actually happening. I'll give you a quick example. I don't know, I might sound very abstract, but and also I might sound very normative, but I'll give you a quick example. There was in 1 year in Italy, in that election, 25% roughly Italian voters were Italian diaspora. So they were not people who are residing in Italy at that year, but had the ability to shape Italian politics. Whereas the migration population was also 25%. They did not have any chance in the elections. And they were being affected by the policies that were made by those who are not even residing in the country. So democracy is, you know, is changing in its traditional forms, because we have been assuming democracy in a fixed nation state where, you know, we have a fixed population. They are changing, they are, you know, making their voices, thinking that the effect will again be on them. That is the heart of democracy. So the entire world, if you see, migration has made a lot of changes, and the security centric view is challenged by technological influences, market economy, but we are still trying to use these traditional interpretations of the words like sovereignty, geopolitics and citizens to understand these very complicated different conditions. So it's not just for Sri Lanka, but globally I think we need a new holistic way of looking at what sort of new tools that we need that would ensure it, and if we want to keep ourselves true to democracy, what sort of tools that we need to understand the world, and also to make sure that people are truly represented in the world.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pavitra Javadar from the University of Colombo. Kusum Mujetilaka, Foreign Policy Analyst.
Thank you, Shamir. Thank you very much for having me. So, like you said, when we started this election year, so our topic today is sovereignty. So I think this could be the year that we reclaim back as people, since I've talked about sovereignty from the external point of view, but this year could be the year that we finally regain our internal sovereignty from our government, because the last 2 years, let's face it, it's been run by people that have been rejected by us. How many portfolios does Mr. Wickremesinghe hold right now? Defense, finance, he's the president. Our foreign policy is, I think, also run by him. Even Mr. Sabri seems like more of a mouthpiece. We still have Ms. Pavitra Vanniarachchi, who was the failed health minister on our cabinet. Kehli Rambukwella, who was under investigation, was given a fresh ministry. So I think when you look at Sri Lanka's structure of government, the cabinet, the state ministries, it's not a reflection of the people's sovereignty in any way. You can use the term sovereignty any way you want, but this is not it. This doesn't reflect it. From that's when we've done with this election, I hope a lot of aspects of Sri Lanka's policy can come together. What are we doing for reconciliation? What are we doing for devolution of power? What are we doing with our security arrangements? Can we envision a future where we might be under some kind of a Indian security blanket or umbrella? Are we going to depend on Chinese spy vessels in the Indian Ocean to provide us with some sort of reconnaissance information, or are we going to start building our own capabilities? Because on one side, we always say, we mentioned it here, we're in a geostrategic location, we have some sort of geopolitical nuance in our country. So having said all this, can we then just take our eyes off our defense capability? Should we have a strong northern command on the South Indian tip? We had terrorism emanating from the eastern province. What does this mean for the amalgamation of the north and the eastern provinces according to our constitution? So I think these questions need to be wrestled with, and they need to be wrestled with fast, because we can't spend another 10, 15 years going over this 13th Amendment and the devolution of power and being in India's sphere of influence. We need to get our strategy right within this year probably, and then do what India did and really find our purpose and pursue that purpose. Because even India, no matter what anybody says, no one does things for favors. People are pursuing self-interest. Nations pursue self-interest. And Sri Lanka needs to start figuring out what our self-interest is and find a way to pursue it as best we can. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Kusum. I now move to Udita Devapriya, Chief International Relations Analyst, Factor.
Well, Shamir, the way forward is basically, I would boil it down to 3 points. A recognition of 3 necessities and 3 very vital points. The first would be that while external pressures do have a bearing on sovereignty, while they do have a bearing on domestic politics, the people of Sri Lanka will always, and this is a point I raised earlier, the people of Sri Lanka will always look around and see those pressures as the result of the failures of the Sri Lankan state. What do I mean by that? What it boils down to basically is, if we don't get our act together internally, even if the whole world comes crashing down tomorrow, the Sri Lankan people will always, or at least most Sri Lankans, will always look at the failure, will always attribute the failures of the country to the failures of the state. So we saw that clearly in the Aragale, because the economic pressures, the economic crisis that we lurched into in 2022 was, I mean, at least partly as a result of these external pressures, the Russia-Ukraine war. but it was seen by Sri Lankans, and not unjustifiably, as a result of successive failures by successive Sri Lankan governments. So that's the first point, a recognition of the importance of the domestic factor when it comes to these various sovereignty issues that we have in this country. The second point is a point that was raised in this discussion about which side we should take. That's not an easy question to answer, because there are at least, I mean, if we are talking about India and China, there are not two but three answers: India, China, or neither in India nor China. With regard to the sides that we have to take, we have to bear in mind that not taking a side is also a strategy at one level. Whether we can continue with that any longer is of course questionable, but the way I see it, whether we are looking at a China-centric world, India-centric world, or US-centric world, all these countries are essentially going across an international rules-based order. Even China is, to a considerable extent, even though there is a body of opinion that thinks that it's subverting that international rules-based order. So as long as this international rules-based order continues, and frankly, I don't see a major rupture with it anytime soon, as long as it continues, Sri Lanka will continue to face those same geopolitical, geostrategic pressures that it has been facing for the last, I would say, 20, 15 years. I wouldn't go further than that. I would say 20, 15 years. So there will be continuity in terms of the geostrategic, geopolitical pressures that are coming down on Sri Lanka, because essentially we are seeing a rupture in certain aspects of world affairs, but it's still that basic rules-based order, however fragile it may be, however fragmented it may be, that's continuing. The third factor, and this is the most important factor, is that we have to recognize, or rather the Sri Lankan government has to recognize, that Sri Lankans can no longer, let me qualify what I said, the Sri Lankan government as well as other governments in other countries have to acknowledge the fact that Sri Lankans can't be taken for granted. Now, the best example that people bring up when it comes to the election...
When you say Sri Lankans cannot be taken for granted, what does that mean?
Yes. Well, the best example I can think of is the MCC grant. Why was that particular party, the SLPP, able to ride on that wave of disinformation which surrounded the MCC and get into power? Because it wasn't just the disinformation that discredited the MCC in the eyes of the Sri Lankan people, it was also these rumors of, however false or true they may have been, that the US government or Washington in general was using the MCC as a lever to basically take control of land in Sri Lanka. Those were the rumors that were flying around at the time. If there was a proper cohesive engagement with those rumors from their side, however well-funded and lavishly funded the disinformation campaign would have been, I think there would have been at least some form of moderation when it came to that disinformation. But there was a persistent refusal to engage with that whole rumor army, with that whole body of rumors that were flying around the MCC. And Sri Lankans, for better or for worse, felt they were being deceived in the guise of getting, what, $480 million from that MCC grant. My point isn't that the MCC was wrong, or the MCC was bad, or the MCC is good, because there's no real good or evil in this world right now. We are facing, I mean, we are basically somewhere in between. But my whole point is, if we don't engage with these disinformation campaigns, if we don't engage with these grey areas properly, Sri Lankans will feel hard done by, whether by the Sri Lankan government or by foreign governments, and they will react accordingly, as they did in 2019 and as they did in 2022 out in the streets.
Thank you very much, Udita. Harinder.
I kind of think, when you asked me about the way forward, what struck me was something which struck me in the last few months. Every day when I go to work and come back, I listen to certain, mostly Sinhala, radio channels, and consistently a very interesting messaging is going from the banks. It's advertisement, which talks about the which banks offers the best pawning option of your gold. So I was wondering, have we come to that situation where the key message, the key advertisement I am listening to in the morning and the evening is telling people, competing banks giving the best deal for pawning of gold. So that's the level of real hopelessness we have got into. So I'm actually not totally answering you as a interrelation. I'm just trying to. This is the heart and soul issue, consciousness. So but that gives us that brings us to a consciousness, no. So as academics or as analysts, as policy, what are we looking for then? Then when you look at the because you link the idea of the elections, what are we hearing? The slogans so far, right? One slogan says, I can fix it all. One slogan says, we have to stick with what we are doing. The other slogan says, we are going to catch all the thieves and get the money back. Neither seems that, plausible. Neither seems addressing the real issues that we have. So I think what we are lacking is, as Sri Lankans in our political imagination, we have been bombarded with visions, but no action plans, no strategies, and no idea of and nobody has been no Sri Lankan has been kind of cultured to think strategically about where we should go as a country. That's the difference between us and India, right? Indians are not being given just a vision. They have been given about a world view, a strategy that where India is going to go next 5 years, next 10 years. We have been given visions of grandiose, and then we have played with it. So what I'm going to tell you is, if we are to thrive in the, if we are to go somewhere in the next 5 to 10 years, I think the political stakeholders, whoever is going to compete in the election, has to give people at least something solid that that is about a foreign policy, about a national economic policy, about a national security policy, and to be honest about where we are. What are our real challenges? Where the region is? What does India want? What does China want? What does the United States want? So I think, if not, it will fall back into what Udita was trying to say. The most number of elections in the world means most largest disinformation campaign in the history of mankind will be unleashed this year. People will mostly be voting on false pretext, thinking they are doing the right thing. Because that is one of the biggest challenges in democracies, where how do you kind of distill the real story? Because until that political authenticity comes from you, we will not be doing the right thing. So I'm not trying to give you a very apologetic kind of thing, but I think there has to be a certain sense of responsibility from everyone. At least this year, if you are very serious about fixing the country, I think they should give people a set of ideas about what they stand for, at least about the national economy, about foreign policy. I mean, nobody wants...
But the president just did that a couple of weeks ago when the parliament was prorogued, the parliament reconvened. There was a policy statement that was issued by the president, and that outlined the vision for the next few months, few years.
The president is
That's
having...
not enough, is it?
No, the president is... because of my limitations as a civil servant, I don't want to kind of do extremely controversial political statement. I can't. But the fact that if we are to bring out like a vision, like Vision 2030 on foreign policy, economic, it is good if these other political parties which are competing, the so-called favorites, also to come up with something more tangible, more strategic, more rational, and that could steer the country forward. Because in democracy, it doesn't matter who wins. No, it is the people's will at the end. So none of us can, we may have our own political leanings, but it is at the end, it is the people's will, and everybody has to respect it. But the people's will has to be shaped not by people's impulses, but at least a rationally thinking public, not a phantom public that turns up for election rallies or goes berserk. Neither is feasible for us. Neither.
Very quickly, Harinder, you said there are three rhetorics that are taking center stage: bringing back the roads, let's remain with the current status quo, let's change. Which rhetoric is going to make it through? If I ask you the political parties, then you won't. So I'm rephrasing my question.
Yeah, the rhetorics is because of, as I started my answer with the level of hopelessness we have. So that is why I fear the rhetorics will drive that agenda. But actually the deliverables, what they are going to actually do to the country, that should be actually also your responsibilities as media to bring and distill what, beyond that.
Week in, week out, Harinder, we are trying to
beyond that, what are their national plans?
Yeah.
I mean, plans may be useless, but planning is essential, so they have to
we had several representatives of political parties a few weeks ago, and we asked the same question. We asked them, it's good that you are saying this, but what is the actual plan you have on paper? What is the manifesto you have in paper in order to drive the country's economy? That is missing.
It's this year or never. If they don't have a plan, if they just keep on saying things, if they want to play a rhetorical political game, all of us are lost.
We're going to be a lost nation.
Lost nation, for sure.
Thank you very much, Harinder. Thank you very much, Attorney at Law, Javed Yusuf. Javed, you need to change the look, the way that you're looking at it.
No, that's Javed.
But thank you very much. Thank you very much, Javed, for joining us this evening on Face the Nation. Dr. Pavitra Jayawardhan from the University of Colombo, Kusum Vijaythiraka, Foreign Policy Analyst, Udita Devapriya, Chief International Relations Analyst, Factor, as well as a very vocal Dr. Harinder Vidanage from the Kottala Defense University. Thank you very much, Niresh Eliathambi, who is the Consultant Director at Newsfirst. I leave you with a quote, as I always do. All government of right originates with the people, is founded upon their will only, and is instituted solely for the good of the people. Take care and good night.